Our speaker today is Richard Reuben, who is the James Lewis Parks Professor of Law and Journalism at the University of Missouri School of Law. He teaches election law, legislation, and state constitutional law, among other public law courses, and has written extensively on conflict and democratic governance. He covered the U.S. Supreme Court as a journalist for nearly 15 years before coming to the University of Missouri. Professor Reuben also teaches emotional intelligence and mindfulness for lawyers because they need it. Welcome, Professor Reuben.
Well, thank you all for having me. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. We're good? Okay, thank you. So it really is a privilege to be here. I have so much admiration for this group. As I was thinking about appearing today, I realized that I'd never been with you before. And so it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to just begin by acknowledging the service with gratitude for Carl Scala and his 12 years. I've been quite the fan for many years, even though I don't actually live in Columbia. His work has been outstanding, and I'm privileged to be Facebook friends with him as well. And I will tell you all, if you all aren't or I'm not aware of this, he has quite a great collection of inspirational quotes, and we do appreciate those, especially when times are dark. So I want to flip over to my slides. I'm a little out of practice because it's been the summer and classes don't start for a couple of weeks, but I've got some slides here to share with you, not too much, just enough to keep us on track, keep me on track, and allow you to maybe follow a little bit easier. Can you all see these slides? Great. So my topic today is overcoming voter suppression. And I was asked to speak on voter suppression, and my first thought was, well, that's pretty bad, and we all know about it. What am I going to say? So I figured I'd talk about overcoming it, and I want to say that my message is one of hope, not despair, even in Missouri. And I'm very candid about things, including where we are. So let me just begin with an historical perspective, and say that this is nothing new. This country has dealt with voter suppression since day one. As you all may know, the founders, the Constitution doesn't even include a right to vote. That right was not recognized until the Warren Court in the 50s, and that was done through the 14th Amendment. So there's no express right to vote in the Constitution. The original voters were white male property owners. That simple. The arc of history until today has been toward the expansion of voting rights, initially to non-property owners, then in Reconstruction to Blacks, and then in the relatively early 20th century to women. And so with regard to Blacks in particular, that's where we've really seen over time voter suppression efforts. Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Congress gave Blacks the right to vote. It included the 15th Amendment, which expressly provided that. They had the right to vote. They actually, during the Reconstruction era, won many offices. The Southern states did not like that for, let me just say, obvious reasons, and that's what actually gave birth to the Ku Klux Klan. It rode the countryside in a deliberate attempt to intimidate Blacks from voting. It was fairly successful. But that said, again, Blacks did during this period run and vote and hold offices. We saw it again in the 20th century, poll taxes. literacy tests, white primaries, all of these ultimately found to be unconstitutional in the 40s and 50s. But again, they were, they were intended to keep blacks out. And I just want to note again that the focus has been very interesting, and I really can't provide much of an explanation, but the focus has really been on blacks and not so much women. Women were last to get the right to vote, so to speak, and it really has not been an issue. It has and obviously continues to be an issue for blacks. And that's a particular concern for this group because Black voters do tend, as we all know, Black and minority voters do tend to be Democratic voters. I will say, despite all of this suppression, the good guys won. With the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it was viewed as one of the most successful pieces of legislation until the what I would say the once Supreme Court has repealed it in a couple of significant opinions, most famously Shelby County versus Tennessee, and in that case, it struck down the Section 5, which was basically the oversight provision, the federal oversight provision, or requirement for states with histories of voting rights discrimination. So this is nothing new. Those people who believe in voting rights have been fighting this battle for years. We're surprised, disappointed to have to do it again, but it probably won't be the last time. So what does the national picture look like? It's not particularly good. As of December 2021, 19 states had passed voter suppression laws of one description or other. There were 11 more states legislating this year. I don't have the final tallies on that, but common features include limits on mail-in voting, tightening voter ID requirements, making voter registration more difficult, and a lot of election administration issues, particularly involving who ultimately gets to decide how the votes are counted, which votes are not counted, or not going to be counted, and this legislation has generally allowed greater political influence. Now, my poster boy is the state of Georgia. I actually hail from Georgia, as we would say in the South, and it was particularly ugly there right after the Democrats won both Senate seats. The Republican legislature in Georgia went into action, basically banned mobile voting, required voters to include their social security numbers and other sensitive data when they applied for absentee ballots. They substantially restricted the amount of time to get and cast those ballots. They eliminated, they said you can't get a provisional ballot if you're not living in that particular precinct. There is less time for early voting in the runoffs. Most famously, there's a ban on providing water and snacks to voters waiting in line. And that's particularly significant in Georgia, where there has been substantial gerrymandering, and in particular packing of Black voters into single districts. So there are about 180 districts in Georgia. 40, I think it's 43 of them are Democratic majority. And that's because of packing. And you can visually see this on this map that I provided for you. Sorry about that. on this map, you can see where the Democrats are being packed into particular areas, leaving open the rest of the state. And as a result of that packing, as of course the lines are longer because there are more people packed into a particular place. In Fulton County, Georgia, where I actually used to live, it is heavily black now, and the lines there can be up to 10 hours in the last major election. That's a long time to stand in line.
Reuben?
Yes, David.
Question. I'm trying to determine what is the difference between these two maps. They're both.
Oh, one is 21. One is 21. The other one is 22.
Oh, okay. It says 2018 to 21. Both of them say 2018 to 2022.
You know, it was the one on the right was mislabeled. Yeah, and you can see that there's a little bit more packing in that. Yeah.
Just a suggestion, you might want to put your display on slideshow, which would make it larger for those of us viewing at home.
You're teaching me a new trick here. So I'm glad to.
Okay, well,
but I think
that's all right. I don't mean to derail the discussion.
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of keep rolling along as I am. It's my only real, chart here. So finally, again, on this theme of politicizing the election and administration process, the new legislation in Georgia gives ultimately gives the state legislature political control over the state election board, which actually is the one that counts disputed ballots, the legislature already has 2 seats, and this legislation basically gives it the power to appoint the chair. That's a 3rd vote. So, I mean, this is pretty heavy-handed. I want to say before we get to Missouri that there is some good news out there on voting rights. There have been a lot of states that have considered expanding them, and some states have. Arizona, Connecticut, Maryland, New York, Oklahoma have passed legislation that expanded voting rights. Most commonly, what we're looking at is expanded mail-in balloting. This perhaps in part due to the success of mail-in and absentee balloting during COVID, but these include, drop boxes, no excuse mail-in voting. One that I found interesting is that I forget which state it is, but which states, excuse me, but there are a couple of states that have considered requiring the state Secretary of State's office to send out mail-in ballots to all eligible voters with prepaid postage for returning it, and so that's something. Easier voting registration, including online, same day, even automatic, as we see at the federal, as required by the Motor Vehicle Registration Act federally. And then finally, some states have been restoring voting rights for felons. And I think that's a salutary thing. So I think it's be a mistake to look at this as all bad. Mostly bad, yes. But again, it cleaves out no surprise, according to red and blue lines for the most part. So what about here? What about Missouri? We are pretty consistent with with sort of the bad voter suppression trend. We passed a new law in this past legislative session, HB 1878. It prohibits mail-in ballots entirely. It prohibits drop boxes for absentee ballots. It requires paper-only ballots beginning January 2024. There are limits on voter registration. There are limits, a number of limits on absentee ballots. Let me just kind of detail those briefly. First of all, you can't solicit them anymore. You can't provide filled absentee ballots anymore. If it's a situation involving somebody with a disability and they have a helper, that helper has to actually live at that address. And so that limits the capacity of community organizers to and activists to assist them. There are also limits worth mentioning on voting related campaign activity, in that private individuals are actually barred now from, under this law, from soliciting voter registration applications. And that's, that's not insignificant. And as was mentioned during the announcement, I believe anyone soliciting more than 10 voter registration applications has to register with the Secretary of State's office every cycle, every election cycle. Finally, voter ID, a constant hobby horse for Republicans. They tightened up the requirements for voting ID by eliminating one means that voters could use if they didn't have proper ID. That is, they could, under prior law, they could execute a statement under penalty of perjury, attesting that they, where they live and that they, they're duly registered. We can't do that anymore. So this is not as bad, as Georgia, I don't think. But it's, the provisions regarding mail-in ballots and drop boxes, these are not insignificant. Also, though, the bans on private individuals, you and me, from soliciting those voter registration applications, again, not insignificant, and I would say potentially unconstitutional. Oops, there we go. So really that raises the question of whether there's anything we can do about this. And I want to submit that the answer is yes. There is, and first of all, and I'm going to give you 3 of them, and I am including a question because that's in the DNA of academics, as you know. But first of all, get people registered. Now, I'm sure that everybody on this call is going to say or think, well, just about everybody I know is already registered. They're registered. They're going to vote right, etc. Find 3 more. The truth of the matter is, I truly believe, even in Missouri, there are more people, there are more of us than them. I truly believe that. And that said, I think that we have to give very careful consideration to what the message is. We need, basically to translate how to put this, we need to translate into sort of common values, the values that might animate someone to, first of all, register to vote. And, from my perspective, that they would vote progressive. Therein lies my question. I think that one thing we can do in terms of messaging is focus on shared values like fairness and honesty. I don't think it's very helpful to say to people that you're trying to persuade. I don't understand how you could be so stupid as to follow these people. I just don't think that's going to be received well. And so I think a real challenge for Democrats locally, statewide, and nationally is to think of a message, to think of a way to reestablish the common ground that I'll say primarily the Republicans have created in this environment that they've created of hyper polarization and tribalism. The goal has been to divide and conquer, and this is an opportunity right now, I think, to begin to reconnect, beginning with something as fundamental and something that most of us should agree on, that people ought to have a right to vote. I think the Republican legislatures are able to do it because people are not stepping up and speaking up. And so I think we can begin just by, making a personal commitment. I'm going to find 3 people who haven't voted, who aren't registered to vote, get them to vote. That's huge. It's a big number, right? If everyone does it. Secondly, don't be afraid. It's a very easy, for those of us in Missouri to have kind of a defeatist attitude. It's very easy to fall into this. I mean, we've got Josh Hawley representing the state. We've got Eric Schmidt about to. I mean, this is just, it is. It can be pretty overwhelming. But this is the time to stand up. To get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, people like John Lewis got their skulls cracked. Okay. This is, power does not like to be challenged. And, trying to expand voting rights is an act of challenging, the powers that be. And so, we've got to be willing to say, okay, now is my time to stand up. Now is my time. I didn't get a chance to march with King in the 60s. I'm going to stand up today in the 21st century. I note here that civil disobedience can be effective. TV screens, not just TV screens, but today, videos can go viral and they can be hugely effective. Historically, those of you who, maybe, well, there's probably not many of us on this call who remember the beatings of Blacks and civil rights workers on TV. We know about them. They moved people then, they'll move people today. And so being willing to, take a blow or two for liberty, can be very, very powerful. William Kunstler, a very famous civil rights lawyer, was once asked what his proudest accomplishment was. He said, well, honestly, it was the first time my daughter got arrested for protesting. and so I'm not suggesting that that we need to go there, but not to be afraid to. A picture speaks 1,000 words. Secondly, I think that a number of these provisions, particularly the voter registration provisions, are unconstitutional as a matter of state law. I teach state constitutional. I mentioned that that was mentioned in the precede in the introduction, and I don't have a lot of confidence in the federal courts today to protect voting rights. And I say that not because of the federal district courts, the federal courts of appeal, but getting anything that is, that's going to expand voting rights for this court by the current Roberts Court, I think is highly unlikely as a practical matter. It has, if anything, it has shown an interest in getting the federal courts out of voting rights protections. That's the bad news. The good news is Missouri is very strong. The Missouri state constitution has long been very strong on the protection of voting rights law. And so this can be a very fruitful area in which to secure those rights. And so, I will say that, if you're arrested out there doing what you should be doing, give me a holler. I'm glad to help on this. I think these are important times we could use a test case. Finally, and this will be my last point. Let's be positive here. I would say that that Democrats have the wind at their back right now. Unfortunately, as we all know, the Supreme Court has has reversed Roe versus Wade, and as I mentioned, it really has been singularly unprotective of voting rights. I mean, these are important things to real people. We have things to talk about, and things that will upset even conservatives in Kansas, as you all are probably aware. The state of Kansas rejected the repeal of a constitutional provision protecting abortion rights overwhelmingly. That's Kansas, and so there is traction on these issues. Similarly, the Biden administration, which gets credit for nothing, but we need to give it credit for how it has handled Ukraine and how it has, sort of reconsolidated Western democracies. I mean, this is not insignificant. It's big. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the misnamed pieces of legislation of all time. It's not all that that Democrats, such as AOC, wanted on climate change, but it's a big step forward. And there's always tomorrow to keep building. It's something to really build on. Ayman al-Zawahiri, as you know, was taken out. It's hard, I think, for Democrats to take a lot of pleasure and pride in this, but it's to the extent that progressives are viewed as softies. I mean, this sort of it's a good rebuttal point. And finally, I would say that the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, has gone nuclear, quite literally. And I mean, it really raises, I've been working on this presentation this morning and some other things, so I don't know what the results. I don't know if the search warrant for Mar-a-Lago has been released yet. But this is hugely, hugely important, and it's something that we might be able to ask our Republican friends. Is this acceptable to you? And that might be a basis for establishing some common ground. So I do think that there are things that we can do. And with that, I'll open it up for comments and questions. Now, I do warn you, I'm a law professor, and I do cold call on people in class. So, yeah, Mary.
My question is also just a comment. I was really interested in your observation about the need for a test case on the Missouri voter registration restrictions. Yeah. And I know that the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is actively exploring development of a lawsuit.
I'm really glad to hear that.
They are made up, but their focus is on the photo ID provisions, I believe. Yeah. So I just want to make sure that you have their contact information and get connected with them, because I think if you're serious about maybe offering your services, it would be nice to coordinate with them. And I know they're actively looking for people who would allow their stories to be used, so to speak, in a.
Yeah, and you know, the voter ID issue is something that in some respects they don't really need my help on.
Right.
You know, the issue with the voter registration is deals with associational rights, the right of free association, and even the this U.S. Supreme Court has been solicitous of those claims. Now, you know, the court with the Trump appointees has not been tested on this, but political association has always been a strong Republican value, and a law that limits your ability to get other people, you know, to register to vote strikes me as a potentially strong, you know, associational claim.
Yeah, the ACLU is part of that voter protection coalition, and I think they would be very interested in that argument as well.
Yeah. And you know, the same line of reasoning can be done, you know, to to consider some of these other provisions, you know, especially the ones that go to our ability to, you know, to connect with other like-minded people and encourage them to vote. Not an insignificant issue. So somebody can't figure out how to raise your hand, but please do. EH.
I cannot figure out how to raise my hand. I'm not very well versed in Zoom, but I was just wondering if I'd be able to, before the end of the meeting, get your email address to schedule
Absolutely.
an interview.
Absolutely. Yes, Scott, good to see you again. But we can't hear you.
Okay, there we go. We fixed that. And it's good to see you as well. I was wondering if you would go ahead and give out your contact information for all of us. So as different situations come up for different groups we may be involved with, we can reach out to you when the time is appropriate.
Absolutely. You can find me at the University of Missouri School of Law website. So if you search for Richard Reuben, spelled correctly, R-E-U-B-E-N, like the tribe or the sandwich, whichever your preference is, you will find me. My email address is Reuben R, that's R-E-U, B as in boy, E-N-R @ missouri.edu. And I'm glad to, as many of, as some of you anyway may know, I was active in litigation on voting rights issues with regard to the Community Improvement District in Columbia, and we made some good law there, and so I'm glad certainly to talk and discuss. I have some other limitations on my time in terms of actually being the one to bring the case, but that doesn't mean I can't be involved.
The link to Professor Reuben's MU law website is also on our homepage.
Great.
And the announcement for today's meeting.
Yep.
Pam has her hand up.
Hey, Pam.
Yes, I have a comment that seniors especially need to, and there's a problem with students as well, to get photo IDs to be able to vote. Seniors, like some people who have quit driving, you have to make sure that you
Absolutely
have a photo ID that's not expired. And the student IDs don't work because they don't have dates on them.
Yeah.
And so they need to be aware that they need.
And I fully expect to see a constitutional challenge to the current, to the new law. And I expect the Missouri Supreme Court to, to look at it very closely with an eye toward protecting potentially vulnerable parties.
Right.
Yeah.
And as far as getting people registered to vote,
Yep.
I look at it as a responsibility, and that, if you want things to change, then you have to participate. And there are the Democratic Party and the League of Women Voters do register people quite often. And so you can take part in those activities to help get more people registered.
Yeah, and
And-
one of the, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
The other thing that the Democratic Party is going to be doing is sending out postcards with personal writing on them. And evidently that has shown to be positive to getting, if you get one of these cards, then it has been positive on getting people out to vote.
Well, and that's really helpful. I'm glad you shared that. The other point that I would make is the point of hope. And I say that because I've got kids 25 and 23, and they're very different. One of them is everybody's all-American. One of them, let's just say he's not. and both of them, when I talk politics about them, they care. They just don't think their vote's going to matter, and they don't really have a lot of hope.
Mhm.
And what we, so I would say, particularly with young people, we have to convince them that it will make a difference. It won't make a difference if they don't do anything, but it will make a difference if they do something. And if they don't like being the generation that's dumped on, they can do something about it. But the way to do that is by registering and voting. And I will say that again, the issues of today, marijuana's on the ballot. They tend to like that. Abortion's on the ballot. They tend to at least want that. I mean, there really are talking points now. So we should feel better about voter registration now than we ever have, and that includes 2020.
Mhm.
I'm going to go for David, and then I'm going to go for EJ,
Okay.
and then Herb.
My question is, you mentioned that we have a requirement of paper ballots beginning in 2024,
Right.
which means that we can't use any more voting machines. And I'm wondering who's using that now and what sort of expense is going to be involved for the counties that are not using paper ballots at this point.
It's my understanding, and that's really a question for Brianna Lennon, who I know communicates here, but she's more familiar with what the counties actually have. But I think the idea is that these old technology, I would say these older machines, touchscreen machines, will just simply be replaced. There will be a cost, and I have not seen anything about where those funds are coming from yet. So it may be what Republicans like to call an unfunded mandate. So EJ.
Yeah, so we talked about things like student IDs and expired licenses not being valid forms of identification to vote. What would be some alternatives that people can use? I understand maybe a passport or something, but can't think of
A passport is an alternative. Any government issued ID that has that is somehow dated it should be fine,
And has a photo.
that's of course, yes, but that is again, that's more of a question for, I think, Brianna. Herb or Sue?
Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And thank
My
you for
pleasure.
addressing this critical issue. You've talked mostly about forms of voter suppression that progressive Democrats and Muleskinners were delighted to talk about. How about some other things we don't like to talk about, such as one my profession, including Dave Luthor, was famous for it, are frequently known nationally and internationally for noting that if you have a whole bunch of elections and long ballots, you suppress votes. And if you go into the analysis of this cross-sectionally and temporally, looking at the partial correlations, you can infer a causal analysis. What about that form of of political repression of voting? What can we do about that?
Well,
And would you like to do something about it?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask, what do I know about that? And I was going to say not much, but I take your point. I actually think that getting people registered, getting people engaged, getting people ultimately to the polls. I think I do believe there are more decent people who believe in truth, who believe in facts, who believe, in caring about their neighbor. I think there are more of those people out there than the people who, are just about themselves, are all about party and not about principle. Even in Missouri, can they be misled? Absolutely. That's a problem. But I think if we, I think it's a matter of how we approach those people and work with those people. That's really critical. Telling them what to you and I might be obvious, you are supremely misled, is not going to be effective. We need better ways of communicating. Yeah, Betty, and then Sue.
Well,
I'm just wondering how they're going to interpret that restriction that an individual can only solicit 10. For instance, Pam mentioned that League of Women Voters gets registrations. So does that mean that it's going to look at individuals there, or will there be?
Yeah, I believe the language of the statute
How-
refers to groups.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Yeah, I believe the language of the statute actually refers to groups.
And so that means that groups can't do the traditional registration drives. And I know last election,
They can't solicit applications. We don't exactly know what that means. As I said, I think there's a lot in here that raises serious questions regarding political speech, constitutional protections for political speech and association in particular. And so I can say that to my knowledge, this is novel provision in Missouri law, and so we don't know how it's going to be interpreted or applied yet. But I think it's a ripe target.
because, in the past, you could get blank registration forms from Brianna and turn them back in. So it sounds like maybe they're trying to restrict that. That would
They are. No, absolutely, they are.
That will be huge if that is restricted. Yeah.
Right. And like I say, I'm not, and I would say this for the benefit of Republicans as well. I mean, it is,
Right.
Ours is a political process, based on the idea that every person, gets a right to vote, has the right to vote.
The other implication of that part of the law is, as I understand it, is that people can no longer be paid to do voter registration, which means
That is correct.
that they can no longer do voter registration as part of their job. So if you look at a group like Missouri Rural Crisis Center, for example, who have paid staff, that's only a small part of their job. I mean, they do other things, but this would preclude them from doing that when they're on company time, I guess.
Yeah. And like I say, to me, it raises serious flags. Sue, was that your question?
yes. Well, actually, I was going to make a statement more.
Mhm.
You said getting people out to vote. What I'm finding is that a lot of people, there are some that forget. And so reminders are also good. But the other thing is some get uncomfortable because there are so many things. They don't feel totally comfortable on knowing who should they vote for. And so I think they feel a little hesitant. And we traditionally had a couple of people that would call us a night or two before the election. Okay, who are some of the best candidates? And we take in consideration things like having heard them on Muleskinners or at league debates or whatever. And we also think what their chances are of winning. It's a combination of those things. And this last election, there were a number of situations in which we thought there were definitely two candidates, but if you have 12 or something that you're trying to pick from, it's hard to know, even to narrow it to that. So And this time we had somebody else, Herb's poking me, somebody else that been out of state for a while. And so they hadn't been around to hear some things on it, but just trying to help people because we are an advantage of knowing and hearing a lot of the candidates, just approaching people and said, do you have questions? I hope you're going to get out to vote. If you do have some questions, I could, I've been able to hear some of these people. I could give you a little background if you want, and give you some pros and cons and different ones. And especially in this last election, we had some that, well, they're two good candidates.
Well, and that's a particularly problematic issue for primaries where you do have a lot of candidates. But it's less of an issue, I think, in a general election where you may have more than two candidates, but today one thing you cannot say is both parties are basically the same. I mean, that's just not the case in this election. And so I think the choices are pretty clear. Dave has a comment or a question.
What's your view on ranked choice voting?
I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it. It's it can be very helpful in terms of cutting through some of the sort of gamesmanship that takes place within political parties and between the parties. I think it would. I think it sort of diminishes the influence of established power structures and creates more opportunities for new energy into the political system. But I'd be inclined to defer on a question like that to somebody who's actually been involved in politics like Carl, who has his hand raised, thankfully.
Sorry. First of all, I appreciate the kind remarks that you made earlier on, and I'll share some more of those quotes with you again. We'll run them through again and see.
Thank you. They're very good.
At any rate, my question really has to do with emotional messages sell in campaigns and political campaigns, and even with respect to new voters and new voter registration and so on and so forth. There are a lot of lies out there. There's a lot of misinformation. What's the best way to deal with that? I mean, sometimes just explaining or undoing some of that misinformation is not a very compelling argument unless it's also an emotional one. So how do you deal with that? What's the best way?
Yeah. So no, it's a really, really important issue of how you deal with misinformation. It gets back to that point that I was making about people being misled. I tend to view people as basically good as opposed to basically evil. It's just sort of my nature, and I think you're absolutely right that you can't just tell people, well, you're just wrong, you're misled. I'm sorry to break the news to you. That's not going to be effective. What I think we can do is, and I think it's very hard to talk to people about things they've made up their minds about. And so when you're talking about particular political issues, abortion, death penalty, affirmative action, I can go down the list. It's very hard, I think, to change anyone's mind, just like it's going to be hard to change your mind. But what I do think we can do is talk about the underlying values, what it is that we want, what it is that we expect, from our political leaders. I think we can do that. And you know, I think it's really, really important to be respectful. I do, even with people that we profoundly disagree. And I know how hard that is. I know. I am there too. One of the reasons that I'm not getting Carl's quotes anymore is because I'm not on Facebook, because I don't want to deal with it. It's just too much of a sewer. Even when it's saying the stuff that I agree with. And I think we all need to kind of step back from this idea that we're always right. I do think that for example, you take an issue like abortion. I'm perfectly out there. I think that people ought to have a choice. To me, it is common sense. It's difficult for me to see the world another way, but people do. And so you have to respect that, just to respect their dignity as human beings. But I think we can talk with them about consequences. I think we can talk with them about, do we want, what do we do with those kids? How do we handle, how do we, pay for their educations? How do we support the mothers? How do we do all of that? Now, I know that that's what Republicans are talking about. I assure you, they do not have answers, because answers would come in the form of some kind of governmental support, and they do not believe in government, right? Public health, okay? Is that important? Well, we're in the still, we're not in the worst of a pandemic, but we're still in one. We have a Senate candidate now who's made his name attacking the ability of local governments to protect their citizens. And so we can ask them, what do you think? Do you think that, that the government has a place in assuring the health of its citizens? I think most people are going to answer that question, yes. And then we can start talking about, well, what is that place, right? It takes patience, it takes empathy, it takes a lot of things that a lot of us have lost over the last 5 years, but we have to get that back. We do. We're still people. So I'll go with Pam and then back to her.
I just wanted to speak to EJ's question about what you would use for a photo ID if you were a student. And if you don't want to get a Missouri driver's license, then I believe that you can go to the Driver's License Bureau and get a non-driver identification. I think I would check with Brianna just to make sure, but I think that would work just fine.
And I also would respectfully submit that the bigger issue there is convincing them it's worth the time for them to go
right
to get it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, there is a government ID, free government ID that you can get, but
yeah.
Getting people to commit to actually going and thinking it's going to serve a purpose, it's a much bigger problem,
and it does take time.
Yep. Herb or Sue?
Another thing that's a powerful correlate of overt voter restrictions that you're talking about is income inequality in the society.
That's it.
Looked at over time in the way, say, Robert Putnam has, but many others as well, there's been a massive increase in voter restrictions and a massive increase in the Lorenz curve. There's a concentration of wealth in this society since the 1960s. And you can trace that back to the last century, as he does. After driving cross nationally, it's not so clear that as it appears in the US case, that income inequality either lags or leads. It can do both, I suppose. But if there is this since if we are now more concentrated in wealth than we have been for 100 years, is it any wonder that we are having problems with voter restrictions, since it protects that? And since it has other relationships as well? Would you comment?
I will. I just last night finished a book by Joseph Stiglitz on the price of income inequality. Highly recommended. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize winning economist. Was Obama's, I think he was the chair of his Council of Economic Advisors, also won the Bates Medal, which is given out by the community of academic economists to the brightest mind under 40. So he has some chops, and he was writing in 2013 to say that this is the biggest problem of our time. It's obviously much, much worse. And where I think where this fits into our discussion is with younger voters. Income inequality, the effect of that is disempowerment generally. Okay, you have to focus on much smaller, immediate issues like, I don't say smaller, but more immediate issues like eating and shelter, and how am I going to, help my kid, that kind of thing. How am I going to take care of my, my infant? That's the world of concern for someone who is, making minimum wage. And I say that with some experience because I've got a son who's trying to make it on a minimum, actually above minimum wage, and inflation during the summer absolutely killed him, just killed him. And so I think the answer to that, Herb, is that we tell them this is actually something you can do something about. You can do something about it today. Register, vote Democratic, because the Republicans really don't care about this issue. They created it. The only tax issues that they care about, at least according to their votes in Congress, is to give tax breaks to the 1%. That's what they care about. And so if you want to change that, there is something you can do about it today. Register, something you can do about it in a couple of months, vote. And it's a matter of convincing them and giving them hope. This is going to matter. Did I miss a hand?
I'm looking too, Richard. We're just
Okay.
about out of time, but we have time for one or two more questions. Are there other thoughts people want to share, bring up, ask
This is
questions?
Kathy Jensen, and I didn't raise my hand, but what I wanted to ask Professor Reuben is, you've talked about more positive ways to talk with people about what their values are, what they support, what they would like, what they agree with. Have you had? Pardon me?
What they expect from their political leaders.
And have you had some actual experience with people changing their minds based on that approach? I think it's a good approach. I think that's the only way to go. But
I don't know. From my perspective, I consider it a victory if they will think about what I've said. I consider that a win. If they'll really think about what I've said, I don't expect anybody to, on the basis of a discussion with me to say, oh my God, I've been wrong all these years. I just don't expect that. I don't think that's the way people operate. But if I can at least get them to start thinking about this in a way that's a little different than the way that they've been thinking about it, I'm going to take that as a win.
Good point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where on the
As you can see, I've got low expectations.
EJ? Planting seeds is what I'm always
exactly. And being straight with people, being honest with them. it's hard today. I mean, for me, somebody said something very kind about my broad perspective. I mean, I do try to be as broad as I can, and as much as I can. It's hard for me to give any authentic credit, to today's Republican leadership. It's just, they don't believe the same things that I do. They don't talk the same language, and the things that I'm talking about are pretty doggone fundamental. Things like a two-party system is a good thing. When you play politics is a game. We play by the rules. I mean, and today's Republican Party is not the Republican Party of 10 years ago. And I've got a number of Republican friends who would agree with that. I mean, it's not that, the never Trumpers, but I mean, was talking with one of our curators, or former curator, David Steelman, pretty conservative guy. He's embarrassed for what the Republican Party has become. It's not your father's Republican Party. It's not your brother's. I mean, they're into something very different. And we have to say that, and be honest and respectful about it, and principled about it. I'm going to say that, I disagree with them because I believe that voting rights should be expanded, not suppressed. That's a value to me. That's important to me. And, fine, you want to have a voter ID requirement, I can live with it. Right? We can talk about how this should be, I can live with that. You make it so that you can't politically, aggregate your power by joining with other people. I have a problem with that. And we just have to be, this is what I was saying, don't be afraid. We have to say it. We just have to do that. If we don't, who's going to? And now is our time. Pam's got the last word.
I just want to say that I never thought I would feel so positively about Liz Cheney. I think she's a real heroine.
I do too.
I really appreciate her stepping up for our country.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that, because she's a good example of we have to get past the labels. We have to get past Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative. We have to start talking about, what we want more specifically, values. Right now, everything is just color-coded. Red, I'm for this, blue, I'm for that. It's that simple. Well, the world's not that simple. The needs are not that simple. You and we're not that simple. And we need to get beyond that superficiality and start talking again and communicating again in a way that is something other than, a snide Facebook post, 140 character, text message. We have to communicate again about hard things. It's okay. We can do it.
Excellent. That was a great wrap up too. I really appreciate it, Professor Reuben. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you very much.
Attaboy.
Thank you.
Just a quick reminder, Pam, who's our speaker next week?
I don't know that we know for sure yet.
Oh, Kathy. Okay.
I think it's going to be a surprise again.
All right.
Yes, it'll be a surprise.
Well,
surprise
come on
again.
back next.
We're working on that.
Join us next Friday, everyone, and we start at noon, and we'll look forward to this surprise. We always have good people. So again, thank you so much for being with us here today, Professor Reuben, and all of you. And we'll see you all next week.
And EJ, do you want to hang on for just a minute?